So today I'm going to watch this video by Hello Future Me. If you don't know Hello Future Me, he's usually a guy that makes like videos about writing, about story, usually a lot of avatar talk. Usually talks about like prose, fiction, world building, all the stuff. But today I see he posted a video with Stalin and Soviet Union, and he called it the Rebel's Dilemma, and he titled it "Why Revolutions Fail." So normally I wouldn't respond to a channel like this, but like I just want to try and give like a live reaction of like see what to say.
Revolutions face a choice. Imagine you're from a small, economically unstable country without much international influence, and after weeks of protests and violent clashes with the state, with hundreds of people left dead in the streets, you've just overthrown a brutal dictatorship which has held power for decades. You've promised the people jobs, equality, human rights, democracy, and now you've got to deliver.
So right off the bat, this is a very sort of this is a very Western conception of like why revolutions even happen, and like a lot of assumptions he's making are typical of people that don't have like ideological they don't have ideological context for a lot of revolutions. First of all, there's many kinds of revolutions. Not every revolution is the same. There are revolutions that are actually revolutionary, and there are revolutions that are reactionary. There are revolutions that happen because society made strides and people didn't like the strides that they made. The Munich Putsch that Hitler did in 1936, that was a attempted revolution, an attempted coup, but Hitler was a Nazi, so that's one revolution. And then obviously the Cuban Revolution, that's another that's a revolution that's obviously very leftist, anti-imperialist. And like the Republic of Futuristan, there's no context for what kind of relationship they have to other countries. They might be a vassal states, they might be a state that dominates other countries. There's no context. It's very he just dives right in. And then obviously this stuff about like giving people jobs, giving people equality, democracy, that's very like any revolution will have its reasons for existing, but that's why you need to know the ideological makeup of people doing the coup. Because first of all, not even every revolution is like mass led. Many revolutions are very unpopular and just have fringe support or no support at all. They might even go against the will of the people, like we've seen in many third world countries where the US has sponsored assassinations of elected leaders and installed fascist dictators. Those are technically revolutions. Wikipedia will call them revolutions, but they weren't really revolutionary. In after World War II, Korea actually voted to install a socialist government under Kim Il Sung, a united People's Republic of Korea, and it was going to be communist. I mean, it wasn't going to be communist. It was like I guess it was technically like communist nationalists. Like communists had lots of support, but it was mainly because they were nationalists, and communists were going to have political power. It was like undoubted. And then America stepped in, and then they divided Korea and saw the fascist dictator and started the Korean War. So there's a lot of complexity that goes on with revolutions. It's not just every revolutionary comes in promising equality and jobs, and then they all promising human rights. He said, and it's like no, there's more to it than that.
The question is, what next? The military swears to, well, quote, protect the revolution, but you don't know how much you can trust them. And even though you worked with some extremist radicals to overthrow the dictator, can you really rely on them now? They want some pretty bad stuff. Your new regime needs money to survive, and all of these other rich countries are scrambling, eyeing up your oil reserves. Breaking ties with any of these people might see the death of the revolution, but keeping them around might destroy it too. This was the exact dilemma Egypt faced in 2011 after ousting dictator Hosni Mubarak after 3 decades of power, part of the Arab Spring. This is the revolution's dilemma.
So he mentions he speed ran through like a bunch of West African countries while showing pictures of like socialist countries in the 20th century, and then he ties it into like Egypt. Like, there's a very loose thread tying all of these revolutions together. Most of the time, the common thread is that many of these countries had neoliberal governments that were plundering the country in some shape or form, either selling off the country's assets to like foreign powers or implementing austerity measures that eroded the welfare state and raised taxes, things like that, things imposed on them by the IMF or whatever. And in Egypt's case, I'm not like an Egypt expert, but the Arab Spring in general was like a whole separate thing. It wasn't really, it would be hard to call the Arab Spring the same kind of revolution as the Cuban Revolution, but let alone the Russian Revolution. But yeah, I'm interested to see what. And then this thing about like all revolutions is problem of that usually they rely on like extremists to help. That's usually in cases where the revolution isn't socialist, because usually in socialist revolutions they don't really have to rely on like people that aren't socialists. Usually, what socialist revolutions do is organize the masses, the the overall like nationalist base of the people. If you look at something like Vietnam, Vietnam didn't need to work with like weirdos. They just organized the peasantry. Ho Chi Minh didn't need to ally himself with like generic rebels. Ho Chi Minh just allied himself with communists and socialists and people that were interested in removing Vietnam from imperial domination. That's not really, I mean, most problems that revolutions face are completely external. I'm surprised that he doesn't mention it. The biggest problem any revolution faces is counter-revolutionary forces invading their country and trying to forcefully reverse the results of the revolution. Even in countries where a socialist is peacefully elected, like in Chile, this happens. So I'm surprised that he doesn't acknowledge that the biggest like thing of why revolutions fail is that they are externally targeted and destroyed. I mean, the revolution in the revolution in Grenada. I know I've not even started watching the video yet, but I just need to yeah. So basically, the Socialist Grenada. What happened was that in 1973, Maurice Bishop basically took control of Grenada and tried to make it like a socialist country. But then what just happened was that America and the UK just like fucking internationally isolated them, sanctioned them, embargoed their country, isolated them from international trade, and basically the end result was that um, they just couldn't continue they just couldn't continue they couldn't continue the projects because Britain also funded like they also took advantage of like divisions within the People's Revolutionary Government, and it made it so that like because they still did things, they still were able to like do stuff with like universal education and housing and women's rights and stuff like that, and basically even the economy grew a little even within the isolation and stuff, but like basically they were able to like undermine revolution. It wasn't anything to do with like um it wasn't anything to do with like the revolution faced dilemmas. It's like no, it was just sabotage. Like the main thing that causes these things to fail is sabotage. Like we can see here, the United States literally invaded Grenada in 1983 because they had to depose the 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 People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada. Grenada had tried to do revolution and become socialist, and America was like, "No, we're not going to let you." And you can see they were supported by USSR, North Korea, East Germany, Socialist Libya. This is the main threats that has to do with revolutions. They overthrew a neoliberal governor and started building socialism in the country. They achieved progress in women's rights, education, housing, health, and the economy. The economy started to grow. It it was one of the very few countries that experienced per capita growth in 1981. GDP per capita doubled from 1978 to 1983. Income tax was abolished. Things like this. And but what happened is internal divisions, obviously stoked by the United Kingdom because that's what they do. And then they placed the leader Maurice Bishop under house arrest. And then there were large popular demonstrations in the country, and eventually fighting broke out, and that was just a pretext for them to execute all the socialist leaders and basically um, a they basically just the revolution was just sabotage and America invaded. So this is the main thing that causes revolutions to fail. So I'm curious to see what he says that isn't that, or if he says it, I'll be surprised.
Part 1. A Tender Flame. In the words of Plutarch Heavensby, revolutions are a tender flame. They're a storm of complex factors all coming together at once. You can watch my other video about that on the dictator's dilemma. They need to be nurtured with a little kindling and warmth, and they're so
The fact that he subscribes to like even the framing of like dictators, like it just shows the ideological bias like he's approaching this with.
easily snuffed out. And that's because of what we can call the 3 I's: infighting, international support, and implementation.
So infighting, international support, implementation, none of those things are inherent to a revolution. A badly organized revolution will have infighting because, yeah, I mean, if you don't have a, like we said in the Russian Revolution video, if you don't have a well-organized revolutionary vanguard that's keeping ideological discipline within the party, if you don't have democratic centralism, infighting will happen because people are sowing factionalism, and that can often be a cause of sabotage. Yes, international support, well, it depends. It's not international support doesn't just happen in a vacuum. The world is a hegemony led by the United States. The international support is usually conditional on staying in the good graces of the United States. If a country like Cuba is embargoed, it's because the rest of the world doesn't have the political will or the financial power to ignore United States sanctions on Cuba. The countries that ignore sanctions on places like Cuba and Venezuela, places like Iran, Russia, China, places that don't care about who the US tells them to embargo. Everybody else, they don't really have that power. So international support doesn't really mean anything. I mean, there's lots of violent right-wing reactionary revolutions that do have international support because again, international support is just it just means like does America like you or not? It's not really anything to do with like in a vacuum the moral goodness or badness of your attempted revolution.
overthrowing dictator Hosni Mubarak, Egypt found itself at a cross.
And what was
Infighting,
the
international support, and implementation.
implementation? I guess we'll see what he says about that. But if he's just talking about generic revolutions and not socialism, then yeah, I mean you can do evolution and then still implement bad policy and people get tired of it. So
After overthrowing dictator Hosni Mubarak, Egypt found itself at a crossroads. The revolution had been led by labor unions, secular activists, military factions, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And while they all agreed that Mubarak
again, you can see the example that he's using. This is not a socialist revolution. This is a spontaneous uprising that this is like the 1905 revolution in Russia that failed because again for the reasons that oversimplified talked about. It wasn't well organized. Uh, one faction could sell out the other faction. People were united under a common cause. There was no political mass line that was being followed. And then obviously the military factions, no one was able to like take control and impose the will of the people the way the Red Army and the Red Guards were able to. All power to the Soviets. So it was nothing like that. So I guess yeah, one revolution failed, but I don't see why he's trying to make it endemic, or why as a writer you can't simply just write a revolution that didn't fail for these reasons. Like I guess he's trying to frame it in the context of like world building and trying to make realistic fictional stories or whatever. But yeah, ultimately I'm still struggling to see what the common theme is supposed to be. I guess I should just let the video play, but yeah, some of these things are strange.
needed to go down, ideological disagreements showed the cracks between them the moment the revolution was won. See, officially, Mubarak passed on power to the Supreme Council of the Egyptian Armed Forces, who went on to dissolve parliament and then pinky promised, definitely cross my fingers and hope to die, swore that they would only hold on to power until things calmed down. But then suddenly it's de facto martial law, and when the Constitutional Assembly is finally allowed together, the secular politicians clash with the growing Islamist faction, who disagree on whether this new state should be based on liberal human rights or the Quran. And the armed forces, well,
Liberal human rights or the Quran. Again, this is something that is very specific to Egypt's conditions and any military faction in another country that isn't Arab countries just have unique geography and cultures. The notion of an Islamic republic as something that is incompatible with human rights is also a Western framing because things like the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, things like even today, most of China, I mean, China has a lot of Muslims. An Islamic Republic, again, it all depends. Like that Muslim Brotherhood that wants to make an Islamic Republic, do they have popular support or are they just trying to impose their will on people? That's the real question to ask. It's not just like some endemic thing to revolutions.
They want to enshrine themselves as the ultimate executive authority in the constitution, and when the elections are finally allowed to take place, it's the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood who wins, with their president Mohammed Morsi taking power. Needless to say, chaos. The left-wing labor unions clash with conservatives, the secular with the Islamic, the Christians with the Muslims, and Morsi only lasts a couple of years before being replaced by the army's presidential candidate in 2014. Despite promising freedom of expression and end to police brutality, a stable democracy, and better working conditions, very few of these are at all realized because of elite infighting, and has been
So again, I agree with all of this, but I don't see how it. I still don't see how it's endemic revolutions. This is just one example, one country. There's nothing. There's nothing generic about this. These are the specific conditions of Egypt that made their revolution fail. It's no different to someone making this video about 1905 Russia and being like, revolutions fail because all revolutions will always have infighting. It's like, except the ones that don't.
democratic backsliding for some years now. Even though it's in a better place than it was before, it's still fallen short of a lot of those aims. The revolution did not ultimately succeed because the revolutionary masses failed to keep united and continue their push for change after Mubarak's resignation. Existing elites, particularly the military, have become the biggest obstacle to change.
This is why Marx talked about proletarian revolution. If you have a revolution with elites involved, the likelihood of it succeeding is extremely low because the elites are who will betray you. Things like in China, there were specific conditions that allowed them to do a revolution that included the bourgeoisie because they were being colonized by Japan at the time. So Mao saying that China needed to have a sort of like universal revolutionary front that contained all aspects of Chinese society that came together to push Japanese people out of China. That was a unique condition that allowed that revolution to succeed. And most importantly, after the revolution happened, communists didn't take power immediately. Like the original sort of like Kuomintang CPC sort of coalition that successfully dethroned the Emperor of China. Those guys still immediately started persecuting all the communists and started basically a civil war with the communists. And yeah, they united in World War II to drive Japan out, but ultimately the communists still had to like fight against the people that didn't want communism and win and impose their will and make China a people's republic. The same that happened with the Soviet Union and the Red Army having to fight a war against everyone else that tried to destroy the revolution. So yeah, I mean revolutions fail if there's no sufficient proletarian base. But like we showed in the last video, the Red Army won the Civil War because they controlled the proletarian base. They had the support of the workers and peasants. The areas they controlled had the highest populations. Every condition is unique. So I don't see again the relevance of trying to generalize these things. Because what is unique to Egypt will not be unique to Nigeria, will not be unique to Cuba, will not be unique to Nicaragua or Guatemala.
Ideological disagreement is especially poisonous for revolutions, given revolutions tend to attract people of more radical ideologies, be it political extremism, religious extremism, or ethnic extremism. Stalin used the power struggle between Bolshevik leaders over smaller and smaller ideological issues to throttle the revolution and marginalize his competition until he ended up with autocratic power.
That is not what Stalin did. What Stalin did, again, I can link to the Finnish Bolshevik video. What Stalin did was adhere to the principles of democratic centralism and convince the party that there were people that were trying to form a united opposition, they were trying to form factions within the party, and this did not obey the principles of what Lenin wanted, and so they were expelled from the party. The people that refused to capitulate and basically apologize for trying to do factionalism was Zinoviev and Kamenev. Those guys got to stay. Trotsky was expelled because he was, doing factionalism. And Stalin didn't just fucking like kill everyone he didn't like. Most of the purges, there's a very sort of like there's a specific reason why lots of people died, and it was because the NKVD leader at the time was literally part of the Zinovievite, Kamenevite, Trotskyite fifth column that was trying to sort of depose the USSR from within. And he intentionally went after a lot of people that were innocent and committed a lot of excess deaths to make the USSR's government look bad and make it more likely that they would be deposed. And when Stalin found out about this, he immediately tried to stop it. And Stalin cautioned greatly against people that were being too aggressive with their increasing search for traitors. This is something that historians generally agree on. I mean, the ones that are not committed to the anti-Stalin paradigm anyway. Stalin didn't just like make a list of everyone he didn't like and kill them to gain autocratic power. What happened was that it came to light because Sergei Kirov was assassinated. Sergei Kirov being the leader of the Petrograd Communist Party, or rather the Leningrad Communist Party. This guy was killed, and then this Nikolaev guy was investigated, and then it came to light that basically he was working with the Trotskyites, basically fifth column, trying to depose the country. It wasn't anything to do with Stalin just waking up and deciding that it was finally time to eliminate all of his enemies. No, things happened, history happened. There was a concerted efforts by Trotsky and other people that were not a fan of Stalin to undermine the stability of the country, and this included people at the highest levels of authority within the government, including the leader of the NKVD. And when that came to light, Stalin put a stop to it. In fact, in Stalin's in Domenico Losurdo's book about Stalin, there's a point where he mentions that because of the rising economic prosperity and general sort of like growth of the USSR around 1936, it was ordinary people who began to aggressively defend the revolution and almost become paranoid in trying to root out saboteurs, and Stalin cautioned against this. If we look at the let me see if I can find the yeah. So we can see here that it's precisely basically what had happened in the USSR was that by 1936 society had started to improve. Like what happened in the USSR was that basically as society got better, people got more protective of their society, like ordinary people. And again, he says here that all of this takes place during the process of limited democratization, yet nonetheless with the enhancement of popular participation in management of power in workplaces, with the replacement of a secret ballot by the public votes, and the possibility of selecting from among a greater number of candidates in elections for labor union and factory leaders. And all of these coincide with improved working conditions and general increasing morale. And it's that democratization that encourages an expansion of repression. And basically, what ends up happening is that people know that like World War II is going to happen. The people know that there's a fifth column that's like developing at the time. People are aware of these things, and people also know that there's a hysteria. There's a general sort of like panic-induced sort of like excessive paranoia about their society, and it's Stalin that had to contain it. They cautioned against this excessive paranoia. This is something that Goldman has written about and Domenico Losurdo is writing about in his biography of Stalin. So again, this is not obviously most people don't know about these things because it's like very obscure Soviet history, but like Stalin didn't just decide to just wake up one day and kill everybody.
Transition period like revolution, people need to have faith in the institutions and political system like
People very clearly had faith in the institutions in the USSR. And again, this is the same with Cuba and China and other places. What he's talking about is not really applicable to socialist proletarian revolutions.
democracy that they're supposedly meant to hand over power to. But if they don't think that they can achieve their aims, what they revolted to do through that new system, even something like democracy, why would they give up power to it? You gotta remember that it's very easy for a democratically elected leader to slide into becoming a dictator. Disagreements
Most times when people say things like that about democratically elected leaders becoming dictators, the people that they have in mind are usually massively popular elected leaders in socialist countries that just have popular support. It's the same we see with like Evo Morales, where people think Evo Morales was a dictator, people think Hugo Chavez was a dictator, or like the current Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela as dictator. Like, yeah, he has popular support because he's a socialist and he does things that people like. It's not a thing of like, oh my God, why isn't every election a Democrat versus a Republican? This is the only way democracy can exist. Like, no. In Hungary after World War II, they banned all the fascist parties from running for office. Was that democratic? This guy would say no because he would say that the communists were making themselves dictators, but the communists were just another party. They gained popularity in post-World War II Hungary. They gained so much popularity that every successive election, more and more parties started trying to like merge with them. And it got to the point where the main like non-communist party, the sort of like social democrats, they basically said that they had to merge with the communist party, otherwise they would just like they would keep losing support and they would basically just lose all their jobs because the communists were just too powerful. That's why the Hungarian Working People's Party was created. The Hungarian Working People's Party was a merger. It was a merger of the Hungarian Communist Party and Social Democratic Party. The 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 communists were too popular, and so they had to merge. And it was that merger that finally cemented Hungary's transition into a people's republic, into a one-party socialist state, because literally no other party had any popularity. They had elections. They had previously been a second Hungarian republic, and that second Hungarian republic had a legislature that, well, obviously this is like the current legislature of Hungary. Obviously, very few socialist parties still have power today. Most of them are right wing. But back then, the Hungarian Communist Party and the Hungarian Socialist Workers Party, uh, uh, back then, the Hungarian Communist Party and Social Democratic Party had basically just universal support because they had rebuilt the country after World War II, and they had banned all the fascist parties from running in elections, and they had done things that people liked, and the first 5-year plan in the country was extremely successful. That was why they were able to transition peacefully from being a liberal democracy to a socialist country. It wasn't anything to do with like what this guy's talking about.
Breeds gridlock. Gridlock breeds collapse, and collapse breeds chaos and war, and we're back on that cycle. Half measures and civil.
This is just basically apologia for liberal democratic status quo, preserving peace above all, is what I'm getting from it so far.
Unrest once more. And often, old social, religious, and ethnic tensions are going to bubble to the surface again. Revolutions are important forces in society, forcing change in static, often terrible systems, but beating the dictator is only the start, and they've got a long way to go before they're really successful. I know it's a YA book, but I've always admired how The Hunger Games doesn't shy away from those post-revolution difficulties. Symbolically, perhaps, but it does acknowledge them. President Coin assures the world she will pinky promise, cross my fingers, hope to die, only take power in her interim government until democratic transition is possible, right? The revolution, though, turns on itself pretty.
This is, again, this is another example of why this sort of like appeals to democracy are just meaningless, because like, yeah, I will only take power as long as democratic elections happen, but like, who is participating? What parties are you allowing to run? In Hungary after World War II, they banned all the fascist parties. That was number one. They said, first of all, the Communist Party had been banned by the right-wing government. Surprise, surprise. No one ever mentions that part. But the first thing that Hungary did after World War II was they said, first of all, the Communist Party is allowed to like function again. Second of all, we're going to have elections, but fucking no fascist party is going to run. That was the first thing that they said. The generic sort of like, oh, only going to stay in power until like democratic transition happens. It ignores so many possibilities. First of all, it ignores the fact that there might already be alternative power structures in place, like we saw in the Russian Revolution with dual power in the Soviets. That's one example. Another example is in Cuba, where we saw that basically there was massive popular support against any entity that was not the communist. People did not want anyone in power that were not the people that had just like freed them. So this idea that like, oh my god, we're going to have elections, like maybe elections are not always what people want. Because again, it depends on the specific conditions of the country. It's not a generic thing. a country might have a revolution where socialists led revolution and they have power now. A country might have a revolution where multiple people had a coalition of multiple interested parties, and then there's a situation where they need to come together and determine what the path forward is. And usually, in those instances, the best path forward is expropriating power from the reactionary forces that the previous governments benefited. Failing to do that is just guaranteeing that your revolution will be betrayed eventually.
goddamn quickly. Candace ends up having to kill her. People espouse these values, but when they want to do stuff, things like democracy can suddenly become an obstacle.
Things like democracy can become an obstacle because the general appeal, the general sort of like idea of democracy is usually not revolutionary in itself. This idea that we'll have a liberal democratic parliament where everybody will debate about whether or not people deserve to have housing or food, none of that is revolutionary. This idea that like the only success condition for a revolution is like when there's a liberal democratic parliament full of every party across the spectrum. That's not really revolutionary. That's very status quo. I'm surprised that he's leaning on that so massively.
And I'll say it again, democracy simply doesn't work.
But more than that, how do you deal with a significant faction of people who are going to want revenge on those who were in power? And not just the politicians and dictator, but the civilians aligned with them. Like, the Egyptian revolution wanted a public trial for Hosni Mubarak, but what about his supporters? And the districts publicly executed Snow. But Coyne wanted to go further. She wanted to hold a new Hunger Games for the capital's children. There's revenge in that. The people who benefited from and perhaps supported Snow's regime. How far do the punishments and trials go?
Well, the way he's framing it, it makes it sound like, oh my God, you are so evil. But you have to remember that every successful revolution will have a counter revolution. There will be people that will try to erode the progress of the revolution. If you saw in Soviet Russia, the left SRs trying to kill Lenin and stuff, obviously people will want to defend what they're doing. So things like this Hunger Games character wanting to do a Hunger Games against capital children, that was also extreme. But like this idea that like, oh, what about the civilians that are supporting? Well, it depends. If you're going to peacefully acquiesce to the new power, then no one's going to target you. But if you're going to like violently resist it, then yeah, people invested in revolution will violently resist you. That's just how it works. There's not anything like that we need to like be sad about, that people want to defend revolution and people are also trying to destroy it. So it's like, yeah, that's how it works.
Representatives, their families, the people who profited from it, the children who happen to be benefiting. If revolutions are down ethnic lines, then they'll often end up targeting the people who happen to be the same demographic as those who were in power, even though they may not be directly responsible. But it's complicated.
None of that, it's important to note that like none of that has anything to do with socialism. And no socialist revolution will start targeting ethnic groups. That's really not how things work. They target they target class enemies, they target landlords, they target I really don't understand why he put Stalin's thumbnail on this video. Like he's talking about things that have nothing to do with socialism.
Because they benefited from it and it's not necessarily right for them to keep what they have. If it's down class.
Yeah, any landlord or aristocracy or Catholic church that had a shit ton of land before the revolution and after the revolution, they start expropriating all their land and they start getting like violently, all their property violently seized. Yeah, they had to come in, they were benefiting, and like now it's time for the people to benefit. So I don't see why that's something that's like bad. I don't see why his perfect revolution involves like the entire country being united and like all agreeing like, no, there will be disinterested parties that don't want the revolution to happen because this previous status quo is benefiting them and the new status quo is going to not benefit them at the expense of everybody else. So they don't want that to happen. This is not something that we need to run away from. We can be honest about it.
Lines, well, let's just say the phrase eat the rich is there for a reason. So when you're writing revolution, you're going to want to figure out where these cracks start to appear, and importantly, you're going to have to figure out kind of one of the only three ways that they deal with it. Do they, 1, compromise, 2, are they ousted, or 3, do those aims get achieved? Counter-revolutions, like in 2014 ousting Morsi, are incredibly common. These factions turn on each other in the struggle over who gets to decide what this new world will look like. Well, the Hunger Games, yeah, it's not the most complicated exploration of these issues. It does at least acknowledge them and how they can threaten revolutionary aims, easily slipping into an oppressive cycle. This is kind of what happened with Stalin as well, despite the revolution's aspirations of a democratic, liberal...
Again, I'm not really sure that that's what happened with Stalin, but...
Socialist republic, ideological disagreements led Stalin to slowly concentrate power in himself, using the...
He did not slowly concentrate power in himself. He already had power. He was already the general secretary of the Communist Party. That was already a position with a shit ton of power. And he had that position because, as we talked about in the last video, he did his job well and people had a lot of support for him. The reason that power ended up getting concentrated in Stalin was because the triumvirates that he was ruling with, like we learned in the last video, the triumvirate of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, these guys didn't like that he was so popular, and they didn't like the fact that like he was being seen as like the sort of like general secretary who was doing his job and like effective, getting things done. He had liaison to the army, he had liaison to the NKVD, he had liaison to God's plan. He was doing all these things as secretary. He was a functional guy, and they didn't like that he was getting so much influence. So they chose to starting shit with him. They chose to fracture themselves away from him and start coming up with alternative stuff. Obviously, Wikipedia says that it's because they didn't agree with socialism in one country. That's kind of like, yeah, you can debate the merits of that. I think for me, socialism in one country was already settled like after Brest-Litovsk, after the Polish-Soviet War or whatever. But like these guys were just like Trotsky. They did not like that. They just didn't want Stalin to be in power. That's why power ended up being concentrated in him. Stalin did not have a problem being part of a troika. There was nothing in history that suggests that Stalin organized to have all his enemies killed or whatever. Stalin was just doing his job. Stalin just wanted to build socialism. Stalin was just a socialist. Like none of these Western projections on him are based in history. They're based in like Cold War propaganda and bias and projection. They want Stalin to be this like evil dude who just said all this stuff about the working class and proletariat behind in front of the cameras or behind closed doors. He was just like them. He was just like the liberal leaders. But like Hotskin says in that video, they opened after the USSR fell. They opened secret archives and they looked at what these guys were saying behind closed doors, and they were saying the same things about the proletariat and bourgeoisie, because it just turns out that communists are communists. So I really don't know this thing of like autocracy. Even the CIA has acknowledged this. Comments on change in the Soviet leadership. Central Intelligence Agency. Even in Stalin's time, there was collective leadership. The Western idea of a dictator within communist setup is exaggerated. Misunderstandings on that subject are caused by lack of comprehension of the real nature and organization of the communist power structure. Stalin, although holding wide powers, was mainly the captain of a team, and it seems obvious that Khrushchev will be the new captain. However, it does not appear that any of the present leaders will rise to such a level as Stalin, so it will be safer to assume that developments in Moscow will be along the lines of what is called collective leadership, unless Western policies force the Soviets to streamline their power organization. The present situation is most favorable from the point of view of upsetting communist dictatorship since the death of Stalin. This is the CIA acknowledging that not only was the USSR collectively led in Stalin's time, but now it will be even more collectively led because Khrushchev will never rise to the stature of Lenin and Stalin. And again, they are saying that there will not be a dramatic purge because the threat of the fifth column already sort of the threat of the fifth column was mainly a World War II thing, and it wasn't just like it wasn't like Karl Marx wrote in Communist Manifesto that every communist leader needs to do a purge. That's not what happened. It happened because there was a fifth column that was threatening to ally with the Nazi Germans to overthrow Stalin's Soviet government, and they stopped it. It was successful. That was why they were able to resist the Nazi invasion. This is the CIA. This isn't some communist propaganda. This is the CIA admitting that there was collective leadership, that the Western idea of a dictator is exaggerated, and they don't understand how the communist power structure works. And it's the same with every socialist country. Even Lenin was not a dictator. Stalin was not a dictator. Mao was not a dictator. All these people were just members of communist parties. They had leadership roles within the party, sure, but they weren't just autocrats who could just like do whatever they wanted. That is way more common in capitalist countries than socialist countries.
Chaos of the post-revolution world to eliminate competition and undermine the role of the Soviets till it was just him. The ideological disagreement prevented the perhaps more popular other factions from
undermine the role of the Soviets. Do you guys really think that Stalin could have administered an entire country like Russia? Do you see how fucking insanely big this country is? Moscow is here. These guys actually think that like the Soviets just didn't matter. Like the actual local communist parties didn't matter. The fact that the RSFSR was still a federal socialist republic with a bunch of ASSRs and a bunch of federal regions in Siberia and in the Far East and in Central Asia, Dagestan and the like. This is so ahistorical. This is purely just Western propaganda.
Competition and undermine the role of the Soviets till it was just him. The ideological disagreement prevented the perhaps more popular other factions from working against him, and his
Perhaps more popular. This is again more Western myth making. The idea that like, oh, there are so many people to the side that were more popular than the socialists, but like socialists unfairly repressed them. Like, no, the socialists were the party of the working class and the peasantry. That was why they had popular support. Every other faction was not in the interest of that. They were in the interest of other interested parties, but not the masses, which is generally why the masses didn't like them as much as the Bolsheviks.
rule was a simpler way out of the chaos. And while people in Russia rightly wanted revenge against the uber-wealthy, Stalin also used that desire to persecute demographics he wanted marginalized, often against the aims of Lenin's original revolution. But it's not
That's a very historical claim. The idea that Stalin took advantage of people's desire for revenge and went against Lenin's original aims. It was Zinoviev and Kamenev and Trotsky that wanted to go against Lenin's original aims, that opposed Lenin constantly. It was Zinoviev and Kamenev who had cold feet before the October Revolution, and they didn't want to have a violent revolution. They wanted to share power with the provisional government. It was Trotsky who had been opposing Lenin basically since 1903, and only joined Bolsheviks in like very, 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 very late into like 1917. The only person that was originally with Lenin's aims was Stalin. And again, we just saw that Stalin and his closest collaborators had to caution against excessive paranoia in the people. They were not the instigators of that. It was the people themselves that were aggressively protective of the USSR. And Stalin warned against that tendency because it destroyed grassroots organizations. It was that tendency that concentrated power upwards. That was not something that they wanted. They wanted power in Soviets because Soviets gave them legitimacy.
just ideological disagreement. The elite and powerful will often join a revolution in hopes of gaining something else, power or money or position, to stay within the circles of power when they know it's coming, and the Egyptian military can be read this way. Egyptian history is a record of the army guarding the interests of the secular state and their own elite position in the system of power.
Yeah, this is not socialist. This is just again, I think he's trying to generalize revolutions too much. None of this has to do with socialism.
The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces did not intend to be sidelined either, nor did it want to lose its self-ascribed role as the guarantor of constitutional legitimacy and security and be stripped of its economic privileges. In other words, the military could see the writing was on the wall for Hosni Mubarak and wanted to ensure that they weren't excluded from the circles of power. And so, revolution. And we can see this, by the way, in George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. Tywin Lannister doesn't revolt against the Mad King out of a sense of morality or justice, but because he's been alienated from the circles of Targaryen power and wants to get in on Robert's new regime. He knew that if he didn't help, then there was no chance of it, and taking King's Landing put him in a powerful position to do so. When the Soviet Union fell, Russian oligarchs saw a huge opportunity to seize state assets and make a ton of money. And that's a huge motivator. You know, they don't ever care for pesky things like human rights or the vision of the revolution. It's about getting a better position from a world falling apart. Chaos is a ladder. And the question is, these elites, the powerful, the rich, what happens when they don't get what they want? How does the revolution survive without their support, without their money, without their men, without their resources? So don't just think about
it. All these things that he's saying are true, but he's still framing them in a way where like it's like endemic to revolution in general, and again not a question that's answered by the specific conditions of each country. Because the situation in China will be different from the situation in USSR, will be different from the situation in Cuba. All of these places have unique conditions. It's not something that's just like blanket applies to all of them.
How elites might help the revolution happen, but where their interests might diverge.
Because, for example, a country like China, the USSR, that has vast natural resources that they can export globally to get access to capital that they can then use to build themselves up, to build wealth in the country, in both in the form of jobs and like material wealth. That's very different from an island like Cuba, that all they basically have is like they're just an island, they don't have much. Or a place like North Korea where it's like very little of the land is arable, or a place like Laos where it's not even, they don't even have access to the sea. So these questions are, thinking about these things in this way will lead you down to paths that are not correct, because you're not being materialist, you're being idealist. You can't just start from a position of like, oh, how can we make sure that the elites don't betray us? You have to start from a place of like, how can we actually make sure that power is in the hands of the masses and not anybody else, first and foremost. You need to be making national decisions in the interest of the national masses and not just like abstract ideals of liberal democratic appeals to freedom and democracy.
And what that point of tension, how is that resolved? Because it can lead to a counter-revolution or an impotent government or another civil war. One detail I really like, and I think it's the Mandalorian, is that after the revolution, after the evil empire is overthrown, we get all these evil scientists and soldiers who have committed atrocities. What do you mean to do with them? Well, supposedly they're sent to be rehabilitated and taught the error of their ways. But in reality, the rich and powerful basically tell them in secret, oh, we're just happy to have you on our side, on the side of the Republic. Rather than it being about justice like the revolution claimed,
And this example he's using is why the revolution in Star Wars, or rather the politics of Star Wars, are so muddy, because there's so many disparate like thematic currents in Star Wars. It's like, oh yeah, we oppose the Empire, but like only Last Jedi came close to really understanding the idea that like the revolution in Star Wars isn't just won by like our spaceships will blow up the Empire spaceships more. It's like an Andor as well, where it's like it's proletarian. It's supposed to come from the people. It's supposed to come from the planets themselves, determining what happens with their resources, determining what power structures that they themselves will create. It's not anything to do with like, oh, the Galactic Federation and the parliaments have decided that this is how things will be. So therefore, yeah, it's like, no.
Instead, bring them in, make money off them, put them in positions of power, and use those skills again, just from a slightly different angle. They superficially supported the revolution, but spoil its aims when it comes down to the brass tacks. They don't care about justice, just money and power. Part 2. International puppeteers. Many revolutions live or die on international support. Money, people, aid from other countries, and all too often this comes in return for trade guarantees, access to resources for their own security interests, i.e. the entire Cold War in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and a myriad across South America. Over and over, Western powers have stifled communist revolutions with sanctions and blockades and sabotage, preventing them from integrating with the international community. I'm not saying we shouldn't sanction North Korea, but it is what has been happening.
Why should we sanction North Korea? This is so insane. It's like he just takes so much for granted. It's like, why on earth should North Korea be sanctioned for resisting US imperialism? Why is that something that we just need to accept as like valid and moral and good? Sanctions are obviously immoral and unjustified. North Korea gets sanctioned because they refused to let America dictate what would happen in their country. The people of Korea voted to be united, and America forcefully divided them and fought a war to make sure it would stay that way. And North Korea almost won that war until America just started like bombing it to complete smithereens. There was no targets left in the country to bomb, and Air Force pilots started mutinying and shit. It's completely insane to frame North Korea's sanctions as valid in any way, shape, or form. That's just completely not true. That's just insane to even think.
For decades, and the United States has been strangling Cuba for a long time. In the case of North Korea, their economy was intimately reliant on aid from the Soviet Union, or after it fell, now China. See, revolutions put countries in really vulnerable positions. They're piss poor, disorganized, they don't have the institutions or logistics that the other regime might.
North Korea does, which is why it's still standing till today. North Korea does have the organization and the logistics they've had to. North Korea has nuclear weapons. And even China didn't want them to have nuclear weapons, and it just shows that like they don't just take orders from China. They have nuclear weapons to protect themselves because they had to, and because they have the logistical capabilities of doing so. That's how things work.
Have had, and they're struggling not to slip back into chaos. And in that environment, other countries come looking for concessions and guarantees. Following Libya's revolution at the same time during the Arab Spring, France sent oil companies to secure oil reserves that they could not get access to under Muammar Gaddafi. French foreign.
This is so insane. America invaded Libya and killed their formerly socialist leader, who had been nationalizing all the industry and like making Libya the most prosperous country in Africa. And now today Libya has like slavery and shit, open air slave markets. And he says that France sent oil companies to secure oil reserves that they couldn't get access to under Gaddafi, and he just says that like casually.
Minister at the time, Alain Juppe, even said it was, quote, fair and logical that those who supported the revolution would get access to its oil, pressing their claim. Without the
This is just completely insane.
support or not giving in to sometimes exorbitant demands, these revolutions might be left to die before they're even.
This because the revolution against Gaddafi was not proletarian. It did not have the support of the masses. It was reactionary. The uprising that killed Gaddafi was completely led by the US against the interests of people of Libya. This is not anything to do with like some poor revolution betrayed. No. Gaddafi's Libya was the revolution against what had come before. Because Gaddafi was a socialist. You can agree or disagree with his exact brand of socialism, but The idea that Gaddafi was somehow the bad guy is just completely insane.
Given a chance to see change, but it also comes across as giving up a lot of autonomy and future investment, and that does not reflect well on the government, especially if they perhaps promised to nationalize assets. Sometimes revolutionary support and
Libya's assets were already nationalized. Most of these governments end up privatizing them to appease those Western powers that support them.
and manpower and money is to disrupt something, like a nuclear program or a new industry in the area, or to simply depose a regime they consider unfriendly, like what happened during the Cold War. Once that objective is achieved, then they might pull that manpower and money and munitions, and then the revolution is left dead in the water, killing any momentum the revolution has towards its goals and taking away any security buffer that allows old powers and squabbles to sweep back in, and chaos.
Again, this is why none of this applies to socialism, because socialist revolutions in the first place do not care about appeasing Western powers or keeping allies. They care about maintaining socialist power over the country in the interest of workers and peasants. Just like East Germany and all the Eastern European socialist countries that had their revolutions and oftentimes went against the wishes of the Soviet Union because those revolutions were catered to the interests of those people. Even the so-called, even the Estonian, the Baltic states, the communist governments in those places, the popular sort of conception is that the Soviet Union just like that mandated that those places be forced puppet governments, but like no, in the Russian Civil War, those places, all of these places here, Latvian SSR, Lithuanian SSR, Estonian Commune, these were all Bolshevik organizing like efforts that's gained popular supports in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But because those governments were right wing, those efforts were suppressed. The same thing happened in basically in Finland. No, not in Finland, in Hungary. The Hungarian Soviet Republic was a short-lived government that popped up after World War One and was led by Nicolas Sarkozy and not Nicolas, but Sarkozy was a member of Matthias Sarkozy. He was a member of that government. But it was a short-lived state, but it was a communist state in Hungary. And it's the same thing that happened in Lithuania. There was an effort to to prop up obviously Western, as it's called, the Soviet puppet states, but it's like all these places have proletariats too that also believed in socialism, and they also wanted to implement socialism in their countries. So it's not something weird.
Part 3. Implementation. It's 1949. Mao has taken Beijing and proclaimed the People's Republic of China we know now today, and is pursuing new communist economic policies, focusing on peasant-led, collectivized farms and decentralized communes to boost the economy. But it fails, utterly. These new
He is very, very, very massively. I can probably do a video on China, but like it does just feel China's economic reforms are massively successful. The entire reason that China exists today is because Mao's land reforms were successful. If anything, today's China has like walked back a lot of Mao's progress by aggressively decollectivizing agriculture and introducing markets again and abandoning the peasantry. And they've had to then like quickly catch up and like do all the poverty reduction schemes and stuff. But like this is not history.
policies prove more difficult to implement than he ever thought. China doesn't have the logistics to reorganize people and resources on this scale. It doesn't yield what Mao thought it would. China lacks the technology to really make it work, but it can't afford it because it's been at war for so long. And Mao refuses, as an ideologue, to let it go. And there's corruption at every level down the command chain, making it difficult to know just what's happening anyway. In the ironically named Great Leap Forward, millions of people starve to death in one of the largest man-made
Yeah, the Great Leap Forward was China's second 5-year plan, where Mao tried to like aggressively industrialize agriculture and stuff, and it didn't work, and there was a huge famine and people died and stuff. China's first 5-year plan was very successful. Again, we can actually see this stuff for ourselves, like without flattening history. It was from 1958 not in 1949. 5-year plans of China started in 1953. First 5-year plan was very successful. The second plan was a great leap forward. So again, during the first 5-year plan, it was successful. Second 5-year plan was the mistake, and China acknowledges this. China, the official line of China today was Mao was 70% correct, 30% wrong, and 30% wrong was great leap forward. Everyone agrees. It's not something of like, oh, China's revolution failed because they were too stupid. No, the first 5-year plan was a success.
famines in history. People who make for good revolutionaries, for good generals, do not necessarily make for good peacetime leaders. So
Who does? Bourgeois politicians with that are being sponsored by billionaires and the Catholic Church. I don't know. He frames it as like some shortcoming that like, oh yeah, the socialists were imperfect. Like they're making stuff as they went along. No one had ever tried to industrialize China before. Why was China not already industrialized? Why was China? Why were China and the Soviet Union peasant agrarian countries for so long? While Western Europe was like becoming an industrialized paradise. Why were those people kept poor? These are important questions to think about.
in world building, look for what we're going to call the implementation gap between the aims of the revolution and the problems they may not have considered. Do you have the tax money to do what you want? The votes, the bureaucracy, the
votes. Oh my god.
logistical and infrastructure support? You can promise to raise the minimum wage, but what does that mean when your country is suddenly struck with hyperinflation? Or you want to raise taxes, but the rich people can just bribe their way out of that, and the judicial system that you're left with is too fractured.
Most communist countries didn't actually need income tax to get public funds because they just nationalized industry and they just got money from basically the surplus value that was created by workers who got paid wages still. Yes, I mean, workers still made wages under socialism, but it wasn't wage labor because like the means of production were not privately owned. State-owned enterprises would still pay a salary or wages to workers, and the surplus value would just go straight back into the state. So the end result was that income taxes in socialist countries were often quite low compared to capitalized countries because there was no need. Just by the states owning all the industry and taking the surplus value and reinvesting it into the country itself, just like Cuba does now, that is more than enough to do whatever the state needs to do. Often at a profit, often at a surplus, and not like capitalism where you have to loss lead for centuries and you're just constantly in boom and bust cycles and you constantly have to bail out banks and other for profit enterprises. I mean, this is again, I can understand like Western people not knowing this stuff, but like it's not just endemic to any revolution. What he's describing happens in bourgeois revolutions with no ideological discipline or no sort of like mass line where they're just making shit up because they just want to stay in power. None of this has to do with socialism.
To deal with that in the first place. Reorganizing society is hard, and that's why a lot of revolutions will try to do something big and ambitious and aspirational, and they will end up doing it pretty poorly.
No, they try to do something big and aspirational, but do it poorly because most revolutions aren't socialist, and so they don't have the ideological discipline to know how to carry out socialist revolution effectively. Socialist revolutions are guided by Marxism and carry out national economic plans and nationalize all the industry and severely restrict markets, if not eliminate them entirely, and reorganize all the means of production along worker-owned or state-owned lines. None of this that you're describing happens in those places because all the land has been expropriated from all the capital. The counter-revolutions have been snuffed out. The bourgeoisie has been deprioritized. They don't have power. Either they are forced to flee the country and live in exile, or they are forced to capitulate and start participating in new society. That is the advantage of socialism compared to non-Marxist ideals for revolution.
Of course, that just means that people look at the revolution and feel like it kind of failed them. Like, you can't do what you promised.
The only people that would look at a socialist revolution and think that it failed them were people who the old status quo used to benefit. I don't understand how a former peasant that used to be illiterate, that used to have no rights, who used to be basically owned by his landlord, who now has a roof over their head, who now has food on their table, whose children can now go to school for free, I don't see how they could look at any of that and think they're betrayed just because oh, there's no liberal democratic parliament elections every 4 years. Just because local Soviets are the ones that are making policy decisions that affect him on a longer time frame than a 4 year election cycle. That's not really anything to do with a revolution. The only people that will feel a revolution has betrayed them in a socialist revolution are people like the Catholic Church and people like former aristocracy whose vast estates and land have been nationalized and opened up to the public to use as resorts, and their former palaces have been turned into mental health clinics and think things like that. Those are the people that would feel angered by the result of a successful revolution. So this implementation gap, it just depends. Again, he's just saying these things generally, but like a socialist revolution has clear goals. They don't need to like dilly-dally about what we need to do. They know exactly what they need to do. They run on it and they achieve it usually,
There's a massive gap between the aims and implementation,
unless they're sabotaged externally.
then it can lead to counter-revolution and throw the state into chaos once more. This is also something that's very difficult for like left-wing revolutions in particular. Like a right-wing revolution, you can sell off state assets easy. That's destroying the state, undoing what is a lot easier. Building up something new logistically is very complicated, especially if it hasn't been tempted in the place before. This is also why there's a tendency for revolutions to devolve into dictatorships rather than democracies. Democracies are complicated.
That is just an insane thing to see. There's a tendency for socialist revolutions to become dictatorships because socialist revolutions have legitimacy in deprioritizing class enemies. The reason they become dictatorships is because the only power that is legitimate is proletarian power. There are multiple parties in China. Again, I don't blame people for not knowing this. But if you actually look at the National People's Congress in China, you can see that there are many parties. How many are these? These are like let's see here. Look, there are almost 10 parties. There's the Jusan Society. There is the CAPD. There is the CDL. There is the CNDCA. There is the CPWDP. There is the RCCK, the Left Kuomintang. These are actually very important guys because these are the guys who are like mainly for basically like taking China back to how it was like when before the KMT CPC split and like basically for Taiwan existing. These are the guys that are for unified China. The CZGP, these are all multiple parties that agree to be, under the guidance of the CPC. You can see here the CPC has 2/3 of the Congress, and obviously in the standing committee, they have similar, actually slightly worse proportions. But this is not a dictatorship of not even one party, really. I mean, Wikipedia might call China a one-party socialist republic, but it's really not that. There's many parties just agree to be guided by China. It was the same thing in East Germany. Actually, East Germany is the best example because they were the most popular uh, sort of thing where there were many parties in the. There was the Alliance for Germany. There was Social Democratic Party. There was Party of Democratic Socialism. There was the Alliance of Free Democrats. There was Green Party. All of these people all agreed to be guided by the Communist Party. And yeah, Wikipedia called them one party socialist republic, but like in reality, it really wasn't that. The 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 leadership of the communists was not in doubt, but there were still other interests represented. So this idea that like, oh, by undermining bourgeois political parties, that means it's a dictatorship. No, they just exclude certain people from power because those people are class enemies.
systems. They require a robust and sophisticated bureaucracy to work.
I love democracy.
If you don't have that, you risk poisoning democracy from the start. Military rule, on the other hand, is cheaper and logistically easier and often rises out of pre-existing structures you've already got. And the more you rely on hard power, the more entrenched those people and that way of doing things becomes. A newborn revolution still needs to keep the people who keep them in power happy, and that can lead to some pretty toxic relationships with the military, with the church, with oligarchs, with the wealthy, with other countries even. The big difference is that stable democratic governments are self-sustaining, they're self-sufficient.
They're not stable democratic governments are self-sustaining because they're propped up by billionaires. This is just an appeal to capital. This is an appeal to private ownership. This is not anything to do with revolution. This is just paints revolution as inherently flawed and misguided, and like careful incremental liberalism as the correct, most stable way to do things.
They don't need to rely on oligarchs or the like to...
They don't need to rely on oligarchs. Liberal democratic capitalist countries don't need to rely on oligarchs or billionaires to prop them up, to keep them stable. They don't need to keep the military happy by encouraging corruption within the generals. None of that happens in liberal democratic capitalist countries with private ownership of the means of production, with stock markets, with no economic plan except just leaving it up to the billionaires. That doesn't happen, really.
Keep them going. At least you'd hope so. And you can actually say the same of like a stable monarchy or whatever. But the point is, how do you achieve what you set out to do when you're simultaneously having to privilege this other group? Pierce Brown's...
What other group? Dude, the only group that should be privileged in revolution is proletarian, working class, and peasantry. Not these fucking oligarchs. The oligarchs need to have their possessions expropriated. This is something that's very basic to any sort of like Marxist. Jeez.
Red Rising series is a fantastic exploration of all this. Like, it has the main character, Darrow, lead a revolution against the oppressive system, but then he finds himself struggling with the complexities of governance. You know, over and over, his mistakes make things worse, with different factions vying for power, leading to revolution and counter-revolution. But Brown...
I mean, yeah, any sort of... of course, he used in 1984. Any sort of revolutionary fiction written by anti-communists will generally fall into those pitfalls because they have an ideological bias in the first place, with not thinking that any revolution against capitalism is legitimate. So of course you can read lots of great fiction by people that are obviously aware of these things, and they will not have those pitfalls because they have a clear understanding, a clear ideological background for how these things are supposed to work.
Makes a point with all of this. Dictatorships are less complex systems. You know, it's easier for them to rise out of a revolution than democracy. Democracies need an informed and engaged populace, and if you corrode that, they fall apart. Darrow...
Dude, why did every socialist country immediately set out on 100% literacy and universal education? An informed and educated populace is a bulwark against bourgeois power and capitalist encroachment. A poor, uninformed, uneducated populace is how people like the Catholic Church and landowning aristocracy can stay in power for so long, because people don't know why their conditions are not ideal. They don't have that background knowledge. They don't have the context. Having a highly educated population is beneficial to socialism because then you can teach people about these things and they can understand them for themselves, and they can be highly sophisticated. They can have sophisticated ideas about their conditions and about their role in society, and not just accept the periphery that is imposed on them by more powerful people. That is why socialist governments want universal education, and they want women in the workplace, and they want minority protections, and they want to advocate for the rights of nationalities, because all of these things undermine bourgeois power. They don't undermine proletarian power.
Finds himself in conflict with the Senate, an allegedly democratic body, but completely a flawed one. And you wanna know a weird thing? In 2019, a poll found 59% of Russians felt the Soviet Union, quote, took care of ordinary people, and
Of course they fucking did. Why is this weird? This is so strange. This is
66%
ideology.
regretted its dissolution.
Of course they do, because it was dissolved against the will of the people. The Soviet Union dissolved because Boris Yeltsin and his friends wanted to dissolve it. Nobody voted to dissolve the USSR. It was forced on them. Even Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine was the most virulently the place that collaborated with Nazis the most, that they hated, Soviet Russia. I mean, even Soviet Ukraine had like 70% of wanting to stay in the USSR. They did not want it to end. It was dissolved against This was the referendum on the preservation of the Soviet Union. And if we can zoom in, we can see, and it's like super pixely. But it was 70% in Russia, 83% in Ukraine, 75% in Belarus. All the Central Asian places were like over 75%. Like it, overall, it was 80% that did not want this to be dissolved, but they did it anyway. Nobody wanted the USSR to be dissolved. Some people might have wanted some reforms. Some people might have wanted uh, some changes, but nobody wanted the entire country to be broken apart. It was something that was forced on them by Gorbachev and eventually Yeltsin.
In 2012, 38% of Armenians said their country, quote, would always need a leader like Joseph Stalin. I spoke about this in previous.
Again, it's not surprising to understand or to hear things like that because Stalin was wildly popular in the time. Stalin himself was a Georgian national. He was not someone. If we see legacy in Soviet Union and post-Soviet states, the only other part of the former Soviet Union other than Russia where admiration for Stalin has remained consistently widespread is Georgia. Because he was Georgian. He was born in Georgia. He was a minority. That was why he was so receptive to issues regarding nationalities.
Videos, but people will idealize the past. Even
They don't idealize the past, they remember the past. There's a reason why old people that lived in the Soviet Union generally regrets that it was dissolved because they remember it. It's not just blind idealism, it's material.
autocratic, undemocratic states with a terrible record of human rights abuses.
Terrible record of human rights abuses. It's just a basic ideology again. These people never have anything to say about the human rights abuses from like American police or the system of mass incarceration in those places in America where the prison industry is for profit, where things like police brutality and sort of like school shootings are allowed to happen because the NRA has a hold on the government and won't allow gun reform to pass. They never have anything to say about that. They only have things to say about human rights when it comes to socialist countries. And human rights in question is always just preserving the existing law enforcement and incarceration facilities that exist beforehand, but just applying them to new people. Instead of applying them to like just generic lawbreakers, they usually apply them to perceived or not perceived, but like class enemies, general people that are not wanting to participate in healthy society. And of course, in the case of the fifth column that was threatening to depose the country, people in the fifth column.
I mean, we see this today with people like idealizing the 1950s America period, which was an awful period for, women and people of color. This is
Yeah, that has nothing to do with the revolution. What revolution happened in the 1950s? People idealizing the socialist country that they used to live in that was dissolved against their will is different from people idealizing the 1950s reactionary United States. This is very strange.
because every regime is good for someone and often more than you think. It's no
Every regime is good for someone. Yeah, I mean, in general, socialist countries will be good for the proletarian and working classes. This is not news. This is not shocking.
surprise that Russians are more likely to think fondly of the USSR when it was a system which privileged Russian culture, language, and people. It's easy to look back fondly when
Again, not only Russians look back fondly on the USSR. Everybody did. 75, 80% of the country did not want the USSR to be broken up. And again, this is something that is very easy to misunderstand. But while, yes, the USSR had Russian as a lingua franca because they were the biggest, Communist Party still took active strides to advocate for the rights of nationalities. The only reason why they were even like made up of the only reason why the USSR was a union of Soviet Socialist republics and not just like Russia incorporating all those countries into their territory was precisely because they did not want to just like privilege Russians above everybody else. They wanted all the Central Asian countries, all the Caucasian countries, and then Ukraine and Belarus, and then Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They wanted those places to have their unique cultures, their unique languages, local representation in governments. This is all history. This is the only reason why the USSR was a union of 15 countries, 15 Soviet republics. It wasn't just, oh, Russia above all. No, they were 15 and they were all equal. They were given equal prominence alongside Russia. In fact, the majority of leaders of the Soviet Union were from Ukraine and not even from Russia. Khrushchev was Ukrainian. Like I think, yeah, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. Brezhnev was also Ukrainian. Andropov, Russian, looks like. Chermenko was obviously Ukrainian, if they name like that. And Gorbachev, okay, was Russian. So a fair amount of, especially Khrushchev and Brezhnev, who were in power for the longest aside from Stalin, were two Ukrainians. So it wasn't like a thing of like, oh, Russian superiority or whatever. Like, no, Ukraine was just as important. If anything, Ukraine was arguably as maybe even more important than Russia, because this was where a lot of the industrial power was. A lot of the population was there as well. And Kiev was a very big city, not as big as Moscow, but like very big. And obviously the Central Asian republics were hugely important, hugely important. It wasn't just like Russia above all.
You don't see or just don't care about the terrible things that other people or other cultures had to endure at that time. We come up with ways to justify it. We
As opposed to the things that they were enjoying under the Tsar.
have a very different narrative, and oftentimes our identity, is wrapped up in that narrative, and so we want to think positively of it. But all of this affects our relationship with the past regime. We're more likely to give it the benefit of the doubt, and it affects
Regime.
how we see this revolution, because we see all the things that it's tearing down and not just the new things that it's building and hoping to do. However, this positive view of past regimes also comes from the implementation gap. Post-Soviet countries often struggled in the wake of the revolutions and the USSR's dissolution.
The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
The transition to a market economy often meant gutting social services and a downturn economically for a time.
Wow, that is so surprising. Who could have seen that coming? Definitely not all the people that voted above 80% to not lose their country. Definitely not all of these people.
Especially when it came to pension systems. See, the USSR had a sophisticated and very generous pension system that was a lot higher and often a lot better than what we see today. So people who benefited from or worked for that were very attached to it, and reasonably so, right? These new democratic liberal governments promised better living standards but weren't always able to deliver. And for a lot of people,
because they never intended to, because that is the entire idea of of putting hands in the power of capital. It means that people won't matter anymore. Only private investors and landowning classes and oligarchs will matter. None of this is surprising to anyone with any basic understanding of socialism.
it's kind of like, well, how good is it really? In some pretty awful cases, some radical groups will start to blame this decline of their quality of life on women or minorities, and that can lead to some pretty dangerous ideologies.
Which is why socialism does not do that. Socialism wants people to be clear about why their lives are bad. Socialism does not need to demonize ethnic groups or religious minorities. It is clear about what the problems are caused by, and they are caused by capitalism. All the stuff about blaming women has nothing to do with socialism. Socialism is for the empowerment of women,
i.e. fascism. But also,
among other things.
so I want to point out that I know it's easy for us sitting here in our modern, liberal, democratic, wealthy societies to sit here and pontificate about the virtues of freedom of speech and democracy and religion and stuff, but it's important to note that the vast majority of people around the world just want to get by. They want food on the table and to feel safe. And when you think about why people don't always just revolt for this stuff, it's because of that. They value stability. And revolutions are inherently unstable things.
That is not always true. Most revolutions are brought on because that stability becomes untenable. Where Lenin said that revolutions happen when the people can't be ruled in that state any longer, and then also the current ruling class also can't rule in that state any longer. It's the opposite of what he's describing.
People kind of identify with systems which they feel are just kind of okay to them, you know? You can leverage all of these sentiments to create some really interesting relationships in your world building. You know, the community who believed in the revolution and then find themselves worse off. The people who kind of were fine with...
They won't always find themselves worse off. If the revolution is, again, not a socialist revolution, they won't. But if the revolution is proletarian, then those people, if they find themselves worse off, were better off before the revolution.
The autocratic regime, but now find themselves kind of, again, destroyed and reminiscing about the past. The people who find themselves way better off than before. The people who didn't used to clash, but now, because of the revolution, are brought into conflict with each other. And also, we've talked in this video about revolutions as kind of forces for positive change, but that is not always true. Military juntas and coups and...
Again, he is describing revolutions that are not socialist. Any revolution that does not want to put power in the hands of the proletarian masses will not be for positive change. I don't know why he says this as like something of like, yeah, of course, no revolutions are the same. It's not always true because not all revolutions are left wing. In fact, not even all left wing revolutions are socialist. It's something that you just have to take case by case and country by country.
Revolutions are sometimes for very bad, oppressive ideologies. It's easy for radical ideas to...
And again, that revolution that happened in Myanmar, that is actually still ongoing. I could probably do a video about that as well, but what he's describing is not applicable to it. It's a very specific. There's actually an ongoing genocide in Myanmar of like Muslims, and the current like legitimate government of Myanmar fully endorses that. And the Maoist party that's fighting like a people's war in Myanmar against that revolution does not support it. So that's the context for all of this.
Get slipped in with more reasonable justifications. We see this a lot with Islamic extremism mixed in with anti-colonial discourse. Revolutions are complicated and people are going to have an interesting time internalizing the now versus the before. And if you are going...
Generally, only white Westerners have a difficult time internalizing that.
For a negative revolution, how do people think about the past? How do they memorialize it? You know, how do they feel about it? Because I think Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale is just a brilliant example of this.
Handmaid's Tale, man. This book is... I probably did a video about this book as well, but Handmaid's Tale is the opposite of like a revolutionary work of fiction. It's just pure white feminist sort of smarter people than me have written about why The Handmaid's Tale is not sort of like a radical or anything, but yeah, using Handmaid's Tale as an example is just very revealing.
And forgive the TV show cover, I'm so sorry, I know this crime cannot be forgiven. Luke and I used to walk together sometimes along these streets. We used to talk about buying a house like one of these, an old big house, fixing it up. We would have a garden,
Handmaid's Tale is just like white women.
We would have children, although we knew...
It's like white women sort of like fantasy about like, oh my god, what if America became the Old Testament or whatever. But it's like it's not really a radical work of fiction. It's not really about revolution. It's about it's about right wing revolution, but I'm not sure what relevance it has.
Wasn't too likely, and if we could ever afford it, it was something to talk about. A game for Sundays. Such freedom now seems almost weightless. So, you've just overthrown a brutal dictator. Things are on the up, but you have no money, you're not quite sure who you can trust to actually enforce your reforms, and cracks are starting to appear with your allies. You try to start new elections, but local governments are corrupt and only take orders.
Local governments are corrupt. This is so confused. This is basically... I mean, the rest of this video, he's going to talk about like, oh, how the dictatorship rises, I'm sure, whatever. But it's like, yeah, dictatorship rises, like, oh, 1984 is so scary. But it's not really informative. It's not really... It doesn't really even explain... I mean, it explains why revolutions fail, but it doesn't really give any context to that. It's just ideology. This is just like... It has so many Western assumptions about the world that are not really accurate.
From one of the other factions. Your allies are trying to seize property from the rich, but some of the wealthy on your side are protesting. The people who...
Some of the wealthy on your side. Why would you have wealthy people on your side as a proletarian revolution? This is why proletarian revolutions are disciplined. There's no wealthy. The wealthy landowning peasants would be our enemies. They would be trying to sabotage what we're doing. They wouldn't be on our side. The local governments that are corrupt, holding local elections. I mean, he says it. What does he say?
Orders from one of the other factions to appear with your allies. You try to start new elections, but local governments are...
Yeah, you try to start new elections. Why would you try to start new elections? This is why socialist countries dissolve old institutions and build new ones and only allow socialists to run for power, or only allow workers in trade unions that are independent. Like, the only people allowed to run for office are communists or independents. They don't allow fucking like the fascist party to run for office. The corrupt local government. What corrupt local government? This is why they remove power from those places.
corrupt and only take orders from one of the other factions. Your allies are trying to seize property from the rich, but some of the wealthy on your side are protesting. The people who supplied your weapons. Who do you side with? You've promised people jobs, but you don't have the money to pay them. And now
You promise you would jobs without money to pay them. Again, this is something that is not unique to every country, but like on its face, a country that doesn't have money to pay people, they have resources, they still have options that they have. If you look at the example of Cambodia. Cambodia was a country that tried to. I could probably do a video on like Cambodia Pol Pot, but like Cambodia after the Vietnam War was an extremely poor. It was an extremely poor country. It had very little in the way of resources, and what they tried to do was get people to leave the cities because the cities were extremely expensive and unsustainable to sustain and prop up. Try to get people to move to the countryside, live more sustainable lives because the overall financial capacity of the state was very low. But if people could, you know, start from a base, start from a sort of like foundation that did not need, insane amounts of money to sustain, then they had a foundation to build on. Especially because the thing with every country is that like, okay, this basic question of like, okay, you're a poor country, you want to industrialize, how are you going to get the money to build fucking like train stations and stuff? You have two options. Either you allow foreign capital to come into your country and invest. That's assuming that you do have the option of like USSR or China like supporting you financially, which most places do. Like I mean Cambodia had China, um Laos had Vietnam. So like and even Vietnam itself had Soviet Union. So um it's complicated. So you either you allow foreign powers to invest in you, or you start from the complete bottom and become like an agrarian, peasant society, Pol Pot, Cambodia, and anyone that tries to sabotage gets killed. And obviously you can disagree with that, but like that's the material analysis. It's not just a given that like every country that has a revolution won't have money to give people jobs. First of all, most of these countries under their old government had a lot of money. That money just was not going to the hands of the people. That money was going to, the landowning classes and Catholic Church and the nobility and the aristocracy and foreign capital. If they nationalize all the industry, well, guess what? If your country used to export grain under the, monarchy and all the profits used to go to the king, well, the rest of the world still needs grain. Your country can still export grain, but that money will just go into the hands of people now. Second of all, if there's no, first of all, the entire idea of unemployment is not a socialist concept. Unemployment only makes sense under capitalism because capital requires a reserve mass of unemployed to discipline labor and prevent it from either striking or gaining too many concessions because the threat of being dismissed in favor of a desperate unemployed person who will always agree to work for worse conditions because some pay is better than no pay will always undermine efforts on part of workers to secure better pay. The reason socialist countries always strive for full employment is because they are not beholden to the demands and the desires of private capital. If all industry is state-owned, then full employment is not really an issue because the state doesn't really care about making profits at the end of the day. There was a saying in East Germany where it's like my workers pretend to work and I pretend to pay them. It's like full employment. Capitalist propaganda makes us think full employment is like a bad thing. That's like so evil. But it's like it's not really compared to the alternative. It's not really that better or worse. It's just what you as a country prioritize. And a country post-revolution can decide that like yeah, everybody has a job. It's not anything. It's not negotiable. You can't just not have a job. It can be anything. It can be farming grain. It can be fucking building tractors. It can be fucking building bridges. It can be anything. But the existing infrastructures that are still there. In fact, in many places, what happens after revolutions is that like things like the gold reserves or like the financial reserves always get stolen. Post World War II Hungary, the Nazis when they left Hungary, they left with all of Hungary's gold reserves. The Russian Civil War after the October Revolution, the White Army stole all of Imperial Russia's gold reserves. These countries always have to start from scratch because of external factors. It's nothing to do with like the revolution itself. And there is still always a path forward if you have ideological discipline and if you have an actual like goal of what is supposed to happen. If you're not just like freestyling.
riots are starting up and you have to send in forces to keep the peace.
The only people that would riot after a proletarian revolution are class enemies. Workers and peasants would never riot after a proletarian revolution because they are people who have been empowered. The only people that would riot after a proletarian revolution are people that invested in the old power being maintained, in the old status quo, and those people are obviously class enemies, and you would obviously have to call those people because they are not for your interests. And in fact, you usually would have to do this because workers and peasants would do it themselves. It's not anything. This is just a very liberal understanding of like how things work.
International delegations are promising to support you in exchange for your oil reserves, but you know it'll mean ousting your allies and handing over resources you promised you wouldn't before.
Again, international support, like in exchange for oil reserves. First of all, as a country post-revolution, you're the one that decides what happens to your oil. So if you want to sell oil, you can sell oil, but like again, you can look at the example of Vietnam. Vietnam, after the fall of Soviet Union, so it's a very hard choice. They had to reintegrate into the world market economy again. They didn't have a choice of like cheating only with Soviet Union anymore, but they still had very favorable terms. Today, Vietnam's economy is still extremely state-led. Yes, there's foreign capital, but that capital treats Vietnam as very beneficial, as very favorable terms to Vietnam. They didn't have to go in and implement austerity measures from the World Bank or whatever. They fucking they fucking decided how that shit was going to go down. And today Vietnam is still a very sort of obviously they have a lot of ties with like America, and they still have like I won't say they're the friendliest country with China just because of the history there, but like Vietnam is hardly a sort of like Western puppet states the way we see with like places like all of Western Europe, NATO countries, just embarrassing, most embarrassing places in the world. Like the things that he's taking for granted are not really always true.
Only if you don't take power now, it'll mean bloodshed down the line, and suddenly you look around and you have become the very thing you swore to destroy.
Yeah, it's always 1984. It's just yeah, this is just ideology. It's a very liberal understanding of like of how these things work. It's not really anything to do with like history or actually educating his viewers about how these things happen. So yeah, I guess some parts were true, but overall, I wouldn't really say that this was very insightful and wasn't just full of like liberal ideology. So yeah, I would give this one like a C minus.